So 10 rules of the ArcGIS Parcel Fabric. Frank Conkling is from Panda Consulting. He is the owner of Panda Consulting and a GIS professional services company that has been in existence since 1998. Frank is a recognized authority on GIS and surveying and mapping technology, including mapping various types of ownership interests in land. Frank has been involved in GIS and parcel mapping since 1974 and has enjoyed the opportunity to study and guide the creation, implementation, and maintenance of some of the most effective GIS systems and most accurate land ownership databases in the country. Frank is a licensed professional surveyor and mapper in Florida and a licensed GIS surveyor in South Carolina. Welcome, Frank.
Thank you. Thank you. This is going to be a little bit like something a little different, and hopefully you all will appreciate this. So those of you that know me know I'm a philosopher as well as anything else. So the way we run our business, the way we think, the way I think at least, is I always go back to one of my favorite philosophers, Descartes, and he says, in order to divide each difficulty into as many parts as feasible and necessary to resolve it. In other words, if you want to try to understand something, look at all the components that make it up. And those of you that participated in our workshops on Friday, we actually had 6 hours of workshops looking at those little tiny details inside the parcel fabric. And we pulled it apart. And hopefully it helped a lot of people understand what's on there. But what we're going to do now is we're going to pull back, not look at the details anymore. Instead, what we're going to do is, once we've seen all this, Descartes also says, once examined and understood, develop rules. Because each problem that I've solved became a rule, which served afterwards to solve other problems. So what this presentation is about is 10 rules that we can pull from our experience with the parcel fabric. These aren't the only rules, but these are the ones that seem to be most prevalent. And these are things that we believe you at least need to understand if you're going to be working in the ArcGIS Parcel Fabric. Lisa will go over some other issues, and she's got another presentation on this. And that's why I say this is a little bit different than what Lisa's going to do, but that's all right. We need to look at multiple ways of understanding things. So what types of rules are there? The first rule is that for every single parcel type inside the parcel fabric, every single type of polygon that we're mapping, and we might be mapping tax polygons and conveyance division polygons and block polygons and simultaneous conveyance and CSM polygons. For each of those individual parcel types, so each individual polygon type, they have their own distinct line features. This is different from the ArcMap parcel fabric, the one that many of us have been using, in that inside the ArcMap parcel fabric, all geometry types are grouped together so that all the polygons are in one polygon feature class and all lines are in one line feature class. Inside of the ArcGIS parcel fabric, in fact, they each have their own groupings, not just their own groupings, but they have groupings as far as whether or not they are current or whether or not they are historic on them. So each of these, instead of what traditionally in computer science we used to call normalizing, you would pull them all together, we're breaking them apart now. We're breaking them apart so that we have multiple feature classes now, similar to what we used to do when we were looking at cartographic data models on there. So that was the first rule. Everything is going to be split apart now. Everything is going to have its own polygon feature class and its own line feature class. The second rule to help us understand what's going on is that we're going to make sure that we put corners or points on the ends of every line. And it's done for several things. One, these can be control points. These can be current, they can be retired, they can be active points on there, but they also serve as a metaphor for a corner out in the physical land. They also serve to help us keep everything organized together. So, for example, if I go in here and select a point or a corner, let's go in here and zoom in here. If I select a corner and then I go and say, move that corner, the way it works is because of topology is as I move that corner, everything else that's connected to it will also move. It will be reconfigured. So every line that's connected to it, every polygon that's connected to it, everything that's connected to that corner gets moved. So just as in the real world, just as in that the real physical world, which many of us are dying to get out and see, in the real physical world, it all comes down to the location of the corners. Where are the corners? Where are they located? Because the corners dictate where everything is going to be on here. And I'm just modifying this corner just to show you that it moves everything on here. So that's rule number 2. Also, just to recognize that these corners themselves, and these are the points here, there is actually, if we go in here to the fields, there is a field, an attribute field here called is fixed. That's what defines whether or not it's a control point or whether it's a point that can be moved. If they're attributed as is fixed, that is a control point and doesn't get moved again. Rule number 3. This rule deals with the fact that we have separate feature classes for each of these different types of parcels. A tax parcel will have its own schema. A block parcel or a conveyance division parcel will have its own schema. There'll be some similarities, but they each will have their own unique symbology, or excuse me, not just symbology, but unique attribution on them. And this is different from the ArcMap parcel fabric that we were using before. Because in that ArcMap parcel fabric, everything, all geometries were grouped together so that all polygons were in one single feature class, so that the attribution was all stored in that one polygon layer. And you would turn them off or turn them on depending upon the type of polygon they were representing. But you wound up with a feature class that had somewhere around 100, 110 different attributes fields in it. You don't need that anymore. Instead, you now have the ability to go and utilize your existing schema, if you're not in a parcel fabric yet, and just append that onto the required parcel fabric fields. You can continue to use your existing schema. You don't have to change or modify your schema on these. And it can be different between the different types of parcels that are in here. And again, just to go in and illustrate this, I can have, this is my fields for my tax parcels, and I can have my simultaneous conveyance fields, and they can be different. They don't have to be the same anymore. They can have similar ones, but they don't have to be exactly the same as they were in the previous parcel fabric. So the third rule is about the fact that the new parcel fabric, ArcGIS Parcel Fabric, does not require that you adopt their exact schema to go and work, which brings up an interesting point, and I get asked this often. Well, what about the local government information model? And what should we do with that? And the local government information model overall is a very good template to start from, but it doesn't mean that you have to go and adopt the whole thing anymore. Matter of fact, depending upon what you want to do with it, you may not want to go and adopt the parcel editing data model. You may instead want to go and adopt the parcel publication data model. Again, it depends on long term what you're going to do. Are you just going to use the Parcel Fabric data for your maps and apps? If that's the case, maybe publishing is a better data model for you. But again, rule number 3, you're not stuck with one schema. You now have your own distinct schemas that you can implement on here. Rule number 4, and this is an exciting one, is that the new Parcel Fabric utilizes rules. It is rule-based. And there's there's actually several different types of rules, but 2 main categories of rules. There is the topology rules that we're used to using. You can see them on the left-hand side here. These topology rules are such as the lines have to have endpoints on them, and the traditional types of line rules, and that they can't have dangles, they can't have overlaps, they can't self-intersect. The line has to be on the boundary of a polygon. Those are the normal type of parcel rules that we have. And then there's also a polygon rule here that says that the boundary has to have a line on it. And the Parcel Fabric actually goes and checks these rules and makes sure that whatever parcel you're building is in full compliance with this, right? And these are structural rules. They don't have anything to do with quality or attribution. These are just ensuring that the polygon has a boundary line on it, and that those boundary lines meet a certain criteria, and that those lines have endpoints on them. Those are the main rules for using topology. But above and beyond that, there's now a set of attribute rules that are optional. There's a couple of required fields, attribute rules, but most of these are optional. And this is where you actually get into customizing and making that Parcel Fabric yours. And you actually get the Parcel Fabric to work for you. You begin to build intelligence into the fabric, into your data, doing things like having automatic calculations occur. Some of the automatic calculations, for example, you might have it drill down through all of your layers and figure out what section, what township, and what range your parcel is in, what subdivision it's in, what lot it's located in, if it's located inside of a CSM or a subdivision, and store some of those attributes. You may also use that same information as a check to make sure, for example, that you don't put a certain type of parcel outside of a subdivision or a CSM. You don't put a conveyance division outside of one. Those are constraint types of attribute rules. So attribute rules become very, very important. You can have it do calculations, you can have it do constraints, and make sure that you check and use it to build intelligence into your Parcel Fabric. It's not just lines and polygons and points anymore. You are now getting a more intelligent Parcel Fabric that you can work with, one that works according to the way your organization works. Rule number 5. Rule number 5, and this is one that is new and is specific to the Parcel Fabric, is that the main organizing object inside the Parcel Fabric is a record. A record is actually stored over here in the Parcel Fabric, and it is a polygon feature class. And that polygon feature class is used to make sure that everything that should be associated with a single transaction is referenced and related to that transaction. And it utilizes the global ID. And if you have a record, and if I go and create a record here, if I have a record and I build, for example, some lines, I go and I build some lines in here, and down here, and I go and I build some tax lines in here. What this organizing object does is it says that while my organizing object, while my record is active, keep track of everything that I create, to the point where I can go in here now, and if I'm careful, I can go in here and see all the lines that I've just created. And if I look, every one of them has this same attribute. The same attribute being the created by records global ID. And if I go in here and I clear this and I say, well, show me everything that's part of this record, it will then allow me to go and select everything associated with it. And if I have it set up this way and I have lines that are all created by this record, I can go in here and click on create seed and have it tell me, do these lines close upon themselves? Are they enclosed? And if so, it will create what's called a seed. And if I have seeds, I can go in here and say, well, take that seed and build it out so it goes all the way out to those lines. And I now have a line, a polygon. And if I look, that polygon has exactly that same global ID. It is the record which organizes everything inside of the parcel fabric. And when one goes and says, well, go ahead and build or build the current extent, what's really happening is just going to the records, the record feature class, looking at every record and saying, okay, what lines were built with this? What polygons were built with this? Do the lines have corners on them? Do the polygons have lines on them? Do you have extra lines? And make sure that structurally this is sound. It meets those rules. So this rule number 5 is a very, very important rule. It is the core to everything inside of the parcel fabric. And that includes not just what you create, but also what you delete. If I delete something, then that rule, if I delete something, the record information is then gone and inserted into the retired by record information. So it keeps track of what I create and what I delete. The record organizes everything inside of the parcel fabric. Quality-driven workflows. Quality-driven workflows is one way in which one can interact with the parcel fabric without actually having everything marked. It's a way to go and build things without having an active record so that nothing gets marked as being created or deleted, because these are not reflections of a transaction. These are actually just corrections to your data in here. So if I were to go in here and maybe say what I want to do is I want to go and correct this, and maybe that should be a curved line. If I turn off my active record, I can go in here and I can make modifications to my geometry and it is not being checked or modified. I can go in here and say that I wish to go and put a curve to replace. Let me go in here and make sure here. I can go in here and put a curve here and say, take it this area here, replace it with a curve. I'm doing an align feature in here. I can then go and select these features that I just modified, unselect the ones I don't want, delete these, and tell it to use my existing records to rebuild them. And that's what this build extent is. Rebuild my existing records to reflect the new geometries on them. And that's what this rebuild does here. It goes and replaces that original geometry with this new geometry, puts new points on the ends of those lines and replaces previously that densified curve, that older geometry with this new geometry. This is what's called a quality-driven workflow. Record-driven workflows, this is in fact where you keep track of everything. Quality-driven workflows is where you're actually attempting to go and fix things up and clean things up. There are some pretty amazing tools inside of quality-driven workflows. For example, there's now a new tool here in 2.7, which allows me to go and take multiple corners and will allow me to go and define which corner is eliminated and which corner is kept. And when I do this, it will go in here and remove that corner that should not have been in there. If I go and do an undo, you can see it there, and redo, you can see it disappear. It will clean up your data, again, under quality-driven workflow. This is one of the main advantages of working inside the ArcGIS Parcel Fabric, is that the cleanup is much easier to do than the ArcMap Parcel Fabric, or I would venture to say even ArcMap. These cleanup tools were not available in ArcMap, but they are available in ArcGIS Pro and the ArcGIS Parcel Fabric. All right. Migrating from the ArcMap Parcel Fabric into the ArcGIS Parcel Fabric. This is rule number 7. And this is one that many of us that were in holistic testing and doing early testing and such, we weren't quite aware of the implications of this. But just be aware of this one rule, that the upgrade script, where you're taking your old ArcMap Parcel Fabric and bringing it into the ArcGIS Parcel Fabric, it utilizes / assumes that you have been using the Parcel Fabric plan table for every single transaction inside the ArcMap Parcel Fabric. And if you've been doing that, great. I applaud you. You're the first organization I found that has done that. Most organizations do not. Most don't even pay attention to the plan table. And I see Lisa laughing also because she knows we don't do that. We want to take as many shortcuts as possible. But just be aware that if you have not been creating a plan for every single transaction, when you use this script, it's going to go and aggregate every single transaction that you did under one record. And while that may not seem like it's got any real consequences to it, the reality is it does, because that means that you've got one record, one polygon that's covering your entire county, and everything is associated with that one polygon, so that there's spatial indexing, there's all sorts of indexing that's going on with it, and it really goes and bogs the system down. The reality is that if you're going to migrate from the ArcMap Parcel Fabric into the ArcGIS Parcel Fabric, it's a good idea to clean your plan table up. Clean your plan table up before you do this. And there's several ways of doing that. And we've got a couple different scenarios we go through with our clients to figure out what's the best way to take it from ArcMap Parcel Fabric into ArcGIS Parcel Fabric. But just be aware of this one little thing. Again, once you understand Descartes, you go in there, you examine all these things and see what's going on. You understand how it works. You then realize there's certain rules that you do have to be aware of and follow. And this is a big one. This will get you if you're not aware of it. You want to make sure that your plan tables are valid and that they're well organized before you migrate it in. It's not just a simple script you run. Second, or rule number 8, this is correcting densified curves. A densified curve inside the parcel fabric or inside your data, it is easier inside of ArcGIS Pro. Matter of fact, you just saw me do it. But there's a couple of rules associated with that you want to be aware of. You want to make sure that you comply with this. This is such a good data set. I don't know whether I'll find anything in here. I don't see anything. Let's just assume something in here has to be densified again. So let's assume that maybe this one line segment here should have been a curve, and instead it's represented by a series of small lines. The first thing you want to do is you want to make sure that you turn off the topology, because the topology will give you errors if in fact you are attempting to go and modify these existing features by deleting them. Then you go and you draw where your new curve should be, also ensuring that you've got everything turned on and you allow it to line without having to make a selection, tell it to realign or reshape that curve. That information doesn't look like there's much change, but let me go in and select that information and actually go and delete it. Now, all I have is I have lines there, or excuse me, I have polygons in there, and I have the existing ends of the curve. I can tell it to go ahead and rebuild my extent. It looks at the records that I have and make sure that each of those polygons have new lines on them now. When I go in here and look at this, and I will then have all of my new attribution on here. I'll have my tax lines in here. I'll have my conveyance division lines in here. I'll have all my new lines in here. But the rule is that when you are correcting densified curves that's in your data, make sure that you turn off topology. If you keep topology on, and by the way, a little trick, the next time you go back to your align features, all right, it will usually go, and if you've got a tool in between, it will go and reinitialize your topology for you. So rule number 8, again, as we study these things, as we watch and record, we want to make sure that we understand what's going on. So again, densifying curves, correcting densified curves, we want to make sure that we look at these. Rule number 9, when you are going in building things, you want to use the ground to grid function to go and correct either for the basis of bearings or scaling information on here. Dirty little secret from surveyors is that in most instances, when a surveyor gives you a CSM or a subdivision, and I not verified this in Wisconsin, I do know that in South Carolina and Florida, it will be grid bearings and round distances, unless they have assumed an assumed bearing on there. so what does this ground to grid actually do? So if I go in here and let's just build a parcel here. Let's go and create a record here. And I now have a record. And let's say that my survey says that this line here is assumed to be due north, and all bearings shown on the survey are relative thereto. All right. So what we have to do is we have to find a way to go and rotate this. And normally, if I would just go and build it, it would do north, over, down, down, and then I have to go and rotate it and such. But a better way to do this is to go in to the ground to grid function and tell it to you enter the bearing that it is. This is due north, and I'm going to go and now digitize on the bearing what it is. And now when I go to my traverse on here, and I tell it I'm going to build tax parcels, and I start here, it will tell me what my rotation is. It will store the information that I input in here. So this is supposed to be due north for 200 feet. All right, and note, it automatically goes and rotates it so it's parallel to that line. And then I can tell it 90 degrees to the previous course, 90 degrees to the previous course, 90 degrees to the previous course, and go and close out. And it automatically is rotated, and I can then go and test whether or not the internal bearings are correct and relative to everything else that's going on here. Once I've finished my traverse, and again, just to verify, my record is watching everything I'm doing. Okay, once I go and do this, let's clear that out. I can then say, take those lines that have been created as part of this record and create a seed, make sure they're closed, create a polygon. It will create the polygon, and now I don't even have to go and rotate this because there's no other lines that it's fitting against. It is exactly along that line because I've rotated it. If I tell it to go and select everything that's in here, and I look at these attributes, sure enough, this one says it's north, due north for 200 feet, then it's due west, due east, then it's due south, and then it's due west, even though they actually they are all rotated to fit into that. The ground to grid function, very important, especially if you're following up and there's either assumed bearings or the bearings slightly differ from what's actually shown on the chat or what's shown, excuse me, you could tell I was distracted by the chat, shown either by the chat, it's shown on the CSM, shown on the survey, shown on the legal description, if it's not in complete compliance with whatever bearing basis you're using for your data, usually your grid. All right. Rule number 9, that's a good one, use it. Rule number 10 is, this is one of those rules we have discovered because as we were starting to do this, we originally were using the techniques that we had learned in the ArcMap Parcel Fabric, in which you build things and you've got your plan set up, you build them with your traverse, you put them in place, you join them in, and then you go and you build other things on top of them. But what we have found is that that may not be the most efficient way of doing things here. And instead, what we've learned is that the ArcGIS Parcel Fabric, because it's abandoning some of that isolated construction techniques that the ArcMap Parcel Fabric had, it allows us to go and utilize old school mapping techniques. And we utilize them much more efficiently than we did inside of the ArcMap Parcel Fabric, in which things such as you build from the outside in, you isolate your error, you go and you build your subdivision polygon or your CSM polygon, and then you build that. But instead of building the lots, instead of building those other things, what we found is a more efficient way of doing this is building road center lines, making sure those road center lines close to where they're supposed to go. Then going and taking those road center lines, paralleling them so that it creates the road rights of way themselves. The intersections, we go in and put safe site corners in there and do the radius on them. And we build this old school like we did using the traditional cartographic techniques that we learned otherwise. We then go and take those and we split those right-of-way lines into lots. And then we make sure that everything closes. We build the lots, use our sequencing tool, and then go and take those lots and copy them onto tax parcels. But it required us to go and rethink some of the techniques that we were using, some of the techniques that were very, very efficient inside of the ArcMap Parcel Fabric. They weren't quite as efficient inside of ArcGIS Parcel Fabric. And that surprised us. Again, so that's one of the rules we have now, is that we don't build it like we used to do. We build it like we used to do. Build it old school. Those techniques are valid. And make sure that you have the quality control that you need on them as you're going through. Rule number 10. So I finished up a little bit early, hoping there's some comments or questions that we can talk about. Kim, do we have anything that we can talk about here?
Didn't see any direct questions in the chat. I'm sure there are questions though. People out there, feel free to either type in your question or unmute yourself and ask away. It's pretty casual here. No, there's no pressure.
It is.
So how often have you done the movement from moving the fabric into Pro?
We have now, I think at our last count, we've moved 15 different counties into the ArcGIS Pro Parcel Fabric. All right, from ArcMap Parcel Fabric. We've also moved several counties from just regular feature classes into it, basic ArcMap cartographic models into it. And again, there's different techniques, different approaches you have for each of them, but it's always about making sure, and Lisa can tell you, ProWest does the same thing, making sure that the client understands how to best utilize the efficiencies inside of ArcGIS Pro. ArcGIS Pro is so much more efficient than ArcMap used to be. The tools have been rethought. It's got a much more efficient way of editing, of setting up these attribute rules, arcade. It just requires that as part of this transition from the old school of the way you were mapping your parcels, you just take a moment and take a pause and rethink what you're doing. Again, this goes back to Descartes. Understand all the little things that go into it. Once you understand all the little things on it that go into it, then you can understand how to best utilize those things. You understand how it really works. It's not just, oh, this is a better thing. No, understand this is an opportunity to make your data more accurate, more efficient, and to make your workflows more efficient. on here is by understanding what's really going on there.
We did get a question, or two of them actually.
Okay.
Brett Boudreau put a question in there. Did you use ground to grid in ArcMap or just start the traverse and then join it to the fabric?
In ArcMap, in the ArcMap Parcel Fabric, there was a ground to grid using standard traversing, but inside the ArcMap Parcel Fabric, there wasn't. In fact, they were using a technique called joining inside of there. And that was used to, you would input it according to whatever source document you had, and it would store that. And then when you did the join, it would actually record the rotation and the scaling that was going on to make sure it fit the corners. It was a slightly different approach to how to go and do the mapping. With old school ArcMap, yes, there was a ground to grid function in there. I can tell you most people didn't use that. And I can tell you that we can tell those people that didn't use it because they're the ones that have little slivers and gaps in their data between the parcels because they really didn't understand how to put them together on there. But yeah, it was in ArcMap Kogo. It was not in the ArcMap Parcel Fabric. It was taken care of with a different technique inside the ArcMap Parcel Fabric. Jeremiah.
Yeah, Jeremy. Okay.
Yeah,
What
what's
is
the
your
number
number
one
one?
don't for people
Yeah.
considering a migration to the fabric? Migration from what? That's the question.
Well, from none. If a person is not in it at all, like, you're not even in Parcel Fabric in ArcMap at this point. You're just not.
I know this is going to sound a little facetious, but this is advice that I've given to everybody for 10 years. I know we've got very, very intelligent people doing this mapping, but the number one don't is don't try to do this without talking to someone who's done it before. Talk to Panda, talk to ProWest, talk to other people and find out where they might have had issues, where they might have had to change and transition, what they were doing and how they were doing it. There are a lot of things that you need to talk about in here, not just whether or not you pull your full schema over, but how do you structure your data? Do you implement attribute rules on here? What attribute rules do you do? Right now, you want to look at your entire workflow. What are you doing? How many extra steps are you doing in here that can be accomplished through Arcade and through attribute rules and through just designing a more efficient workflow? That's the first thing you want to do. You don't want to just say, well, let's take it from here, put it in here. You want to think about it. You want to think about whether or not are you using annotation right now? How are you going to implement annotation? The Parcel Fabric, you can use annotation on it, but there's considerations you want to have. One, you're going to have to move from ArcMap annotation into ArcGIS Pro annotation, and that requires a rethink and considering unseen consequences, because once you migrate into ArcGIS Pro annotation, you can never read it in ArcMap again. So which means you're making that cut and you're leaving any ArcMap users that are still out there, you're going to force them to move into something that can read the new ArcGIS Pro annotation. Again, there's a lot of little things in here that that you just want to get some advice and guidance on. And I think Lisa's going to go and agree with me on that. You want to do that. You want to plan. There's a lot of planning you want to do. I can tell you this, that for every one of our clients, we usually give them 3 different sets of data. We do an initial prototype in which we just take it, we take our first guess at it. Let me look at your data. Let me see what it looks like. I'll take a first shot at what I think you're going to want. And then we hand it to them. And then we let them test it and use it and see. And then we come back and we do a second prototype. Say, okay, now this is a little bit better. We've integrated some of the more enhanced capabilities. We've taken care of your annotation. We've looked at maybe building some really smart labeling in here. And then once we're in agreement with that, agreement in the schema, agreement in the attribute rules, the arcade labeling expressions, the symbology, then we'll do the final migration of the data. So this is not just a one-time deal. This is things that there's a lot of things you want to think about as you're making that transition. It's actually a great question, Jeremiah. Thank you for that.
All right. We have a couple more questions in the chat, but we are at the end of our time.